All right, this is a topic that applies to everybody around the globe. We are all human, and so we're going to talk about our amazing human brains and really some of the good things about them and some of the things about the way our brains work that can lead us astray. And this is, of course, especially important when we're talking about the justice system, right? How it can lead us astray, but it's human. It's across the board. It's not just in the justice system. So we're going to talk a little bit about things like how the brain processes information. That's kind of key to really key to how we're going to figure out what to do about it. What's tripping us up sometimes, and what do we do about it? That affects our perceptions and our behavior. And there are certain factors that increase the risk of this happening, of kind of these underlying biases rising to the surface. We'll talk about what those risk factors are and then try to address some of them in terms of what are the strategies we can use to minimize the likelihood of these implicit biases. These are really built into who we are as humans. We have really two information processing systems that they've kind of looked at. There are different ways of talking about how the brain works, quite a few different ways. One of the ways that's really come to the forefront now is looking at it as almost like two different systems that are running parallel. One of them is the emotional, unconscious, reflexive. We kind of respond very quickly. Reflexive thinking, and that's really kind of considered the deep part of our brain. Some of the earlier things that developed in our brain are that part. They're really unconscious, fast-moving, and then there's the other part that's really what we would call more executive functioning. You've probably heard of the prefrontal cortex, the front part of the brain that's been more recently developed, and that's a little bit slower and still, of course, pretty important to how we think, but very different in terms of how these systems work. Both of them are integral to who we are as people, who we are as humans, and yet one is moving really fast, kind of at a visceral level, at a gut level, implicit, under the radars, kind of what we're talking about. It's not obvious, we're not conscious of it. So we've got unconscious thinking and then much more conscious thinking, the rational part of our brain, that front part of our brain, and this is what we're most aware of. So to us, this seems like the main way we think is in that part of the brain, because that's what we're conscious of. But it depends on the researchers you look at. Kind of the lowest level of the percentage of how much they think is going on in the unconscious part, though, usually you're hearing 90% plus, often up to 99 point some odd, of how much is going on under our conscious awareness. Now this is critical because this is stuff, if you don't know what's happening, it's a lot harder to control, way harder to control. And of course, when we're saying the conscious effort is an actual effort, it takes some intentionality. You have to decide to do it more than the unconscious part, which is going on under the scenes, like under the surface all the time. So that's a big issue. The biggest issue here is that we really don't realize how much is going on under our conscious awareness. And we need to bump up that awareness of what's going on and what we can do to control it. So tons going on under the radar for a good reason. We have all kinds of information coming at us. Lots of information. We're really flooded with information, and we have to decide how to make sense of it. And that's really what we're doing all the time, is trying to make meaning, trying to figure out what things mean and how to make sense of the world. So you have all this information coming in, we're trying to figure it out pretty quickly, and there's some things our brains have developed to do that. A lot of this development came from quite a ways back when we were in different situations in terms of survival. We often lived in very small groups, much more physical danger, much more of the time. So the things that developed have developed for really kind of a different social context than we're in now, where we're often in large groups that are not homogeneous, right? That you have all kinds of differences and all kinds of variety in the groups of people you're meeting. So what we're doing to make sense of this world, of this complicated world, is looking under conscious awareness again. Our brains are kind of scanning, looking for patterns. How do we make sense of this? Our brains are so eager to try to find a pattern to make sense of things, we'll even put a pattern on some things. We'll impose patterns when there isn't one, because that's one of the things that makes us feel better, making sense of things that way. So really, our brains are built to categorize and generalize. We're built to do that, and it helps us in many ways. It helps us do this very quick reaction. What do we do? How do I respond? What does this mean? We need to be categorizing. But of course, anytime we categorize, anytime we generalize, there's the issue, the potential for overgeneralizing. Right, for letting the categories become too rigid. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But first, really, okay, it's a good thing to be able to quickly recognize patterns. Right, that's not a bad thing. It's a good thing to be able to do that. And of course, goes back to some of those survival skills. However, that idea that our condition, our human condition, is that our brains are built to categorize, that we're doing it all the time without realizing it, key, right, without even realizing it, under our conscious awareness, the problem comes in that once we categorize something or someone, oh, this is that kind of person or this kind of case, whatever it might be, then we tend to human response. The human response is to tend to respond to the category that the individual or case or whatever belongs to. We tend to respond to categories once we put things in categories, and we do that all the time. We're constantly categorizing under our conscious awareness. So our brains are kind of setting up, who is this, what does it mean, and then once we have someone kind of, okay, this is that kind of person, this kind of case, whatever it might be, then we're going to respond to what we think is typical, what our brains, what social kind of mores have told us are typical things related to that category. So we tend to respond to the category. And we're going to do a little activity now. I'm going to have you fill in the blank in just a second. So out loud all together, I'm going to want you to fill in the blank when I tell you. But first I want to show you this top word spelled that way. Tell you it's pronounced poke. Second word spelled that way. Tell you it's pronounced folk. And then I ask you what you call the white part of an egg. You would say yolk. The white part of an egg. Oh, man, right? Oh. This one got me too, all right? It got me too the first time. So this is what our brains do. This is your brain on categories, right? This is how strong categories are. I just told you how strong they are, how we tend to respond to categories, and we still do it because it's human. Because it is human. And therefore, we know, right? We know these categories are that strong, and that even when we're kind of aware of them, we're still going to do it. We're going to make that leap. We have to try to figure out what to do so we don't make the leap when we should be treating the individual case, the individual person, right? How do we do that when our brains are set up to do this, right? Okay, so talking a little bit more about that automatic processing, implicit, under conscious awareness. Obviously, I've said there's some good things about it, but there are some major hazards to what I might call autopilot, when we go on autopilot, which is all that stuff under conscious awareness. What we're kind of doing really with categorizing is we're saying, well, most likely this means that. Most likely this person is going to act like that. We're doing that most likely leap, right? Trying to figure out how to make sense of the world. And yet, most likely, okay, we're going to be accurate some of the time, but it's almost guaranteed we're going to be wrong some of the time, right? We're going to be wrong, so we have to be careful. So the problem also comes in, even if it feels right, even if it's not accurate, it can feel right, because it's what we're used to. So I'm going to have you do a little activity now. I want you to lace your fingers together. So you're going to lace your fingers together. So clasp your hands by lacing your fingers together. And now just notice which index finger, which pointer finger is on top. Because what I'm going to have you do is take them apart, move them down one, and have the other index finger, the other pointer finger on top. Now, can somebody give me a few words of how that feels? Weird, awkward, wrong. I heard wrong. There's no right or wrong to how we do this. It's what we're used to. It's what we're used to. And yet it feels, I did this once with a group of judges, and I had a judge, after he did it, he went like this. Ew, like yuck, you go away. It feels that wrong, even though there's not a right or wrong. But when we're working with people who are from groups different from us, right, there might be different responses than what we're used to in our own cultures, in our own different social groups we're part of, then we can get that feeling that it's just kind of awkward or wrong, and that might mean we kind of push away from it. We treat people differently, and it leaks through our nonverbal communication, so our eye contact, how much time we spend with somebody, how close we might stand to them when we're talking to them. All kinds of research on this in areas like interviewing, employment interviewing. You're interviewing somebody for a job, and what does it feel like? Well, if you're not quite used to it, right, we'll try to distance ourselves. And what are the impacts of that, right? Whether it's in the hiring situation, whether it's in, dealing with people as they're coming into the courthouse and you want to make sure they feel like it's a fair process, it's all of those things. So even though something feels right, you can't necessarily count on it being right. The individual differences end up discounted. We don't look at the individual differences. Sometimes it makes us focus on the wrong cues. I've heard in court people, an attorney emphasize the word hoodie. He was a young man wearing a hoodie. And the hoodie, the sweatshirt with the hood, obviously carried some implications with it in terms of where he was from and whether he should have been doing what he was doing. And just pushing a little bit on that word, right, made people focus on a little bit of the wrong cue there. Okay, whatever. So he's wearing a sweatshirt, right? He's wearing a sweatshirt. That cue shouldn't be the thing that determines how people are going to treat him. All right, and of course there are just some predictable errors that we're going to make. We know there are errors. There's some really interesting research out there on what's called heuristics, a whole bunch of heuristics, the shortcuts our brains take and how those trip us up. In our hour today, we're not going to talk about those, but I have a whole bunch of resources that are on the NACM website. So I have one of the resources for this session include a whole list and links to a bunch of resources that include more on the heuristics as well. Okay, so what's kind of the opposite of that automatic processing, that autopilot? It's really what we call high effort processing, right? It's the other kind of thinking, the rational thinking that's much more explicit, much more obvious to us. This is something, it's part of us being human as well, just like the other kind is. It's a different kind of thinking, but still integral to who we are as people. And in this kind of thinking, we're really considering the guidelines carefully. Now, guidelines are whatever it might be rules, might be unwritten rules, but we're really trying to pull it apart and consider it and lay it out, and how does this align with these factors? So it's one of the things I do as a teacher at the university is when I'm grading these long papers. I teach intercultural communication, and it's a 400 level class. There's lots of writing involved. With a lot of writing comes in some subjectivity, right? There's a fair amount of room for me of how I'm going to grade things. And so I found it very useful to lay out, here are the guidelines for an A, here are the guidelines for both me and for the students. But to pull back to it when I grade, to actually have it there when I'm grading. I need to do that, otherwise I go onto autopilot because I've been teaching for so long now. All right, so we're considering guidelines carefully, really kind of pulling things apart, looking at it. Our accuracy in many kinds of thinking, especially more complex areas, complex issues, this is more accurate than that under the radar thinking we do. This tends to be more accurate, especially in complex areas. It also can kind of help us suppress some of that generalized acting that we might do, generalized behaviors we might do based on what's going on under the radar. So stereotypes, right? Trying to not just respond to the stereotype. If you do more of this kind of thinking, it helps. It helps. It balances it out. It doesn't take it away, but it balances it out. Now, there are a couple things about this kind of thinking. We tend to be better at it in certain conditions. Now, one of those is a low cognitive load. And so what a cognitive load, and I'll give you an example of it in just a minute, but really what it is how much information you have to process, how quickly, and how complex is it. So it's kind of how much information, how complex, how fast do you have to do something with it. If you have lots of complex information that you have to do something with in a hurry, that's a very high cognitive load. And when we have that, we can't do this thinking as well. We're not taking the time to pull things apart and really look at it and consider it and reflect on it, right? We become more reflexive, where we're just responding instead of reflecting on it. And what happens then is we rely then more, our brains rely more on these implicit underlying categories and biases that we have. So we're going to do something now, another activity, and this one I'm going to have you say something all out loud again. And what we're going to do is you all have the same task. We're going to say the color things are written in. So I'll do this a couple different times, a couple different ways. The Stroop Task goes way back, way back. They used it to kind of look at how the brain processes information, how accurate it can be under conditions of, like, as you get less and less oxygen as you go higher and higher up a mountain, say. And so it was started there, and it's been used in lots of different ways. So the Stroop Task, sometimes called the Stroop color word test. So what your whole task, that all the time I'm going to have you say the color things are in. All right, we're going to see some words in a minute, but you don't need to read the words, you just need to say the color. So we're going to just practice on this. I know there may be people with some issues as far as the colors, or sometimes the projectors are a little different, so you'll still get something out of this even if you don't see all the colors. But we're going to go through it fairly quickly. These will be the colors you see for the rest of the activity. So nice and quick all together. Let's say these colors: yellow, red, orange, brown, a little faster, blue, pink, green, purple. Okay, so those are the colors standing for purple and for pink and all those. Now, you might have some idea what's coming, right? We're going to see some of these, we're going to see the same colors. They're also going to be words. Again, you don't have to read the words. You just need to say the color it's written in. Okay, nice and fast. Here we go. Ready? Red, purple, yellow, orange, brown, green, pink. Dang, you guys are really good. Now you know what's coming though, right? Okay, so we're going to have a few more words. This time there'll be more, so we got to really keep moving here. But the same task, say the color the words are written in. Ready, go. Orange, purple, come on, nice and fast. Keep going. Here we go. What's happening here? Oh, stick with me. We can do it. Oh, holy cow, what happened? What happened? Right? So this is a high cognitive load. All right? That's a high cognitive load. You just experienced it. If you had had more time to kind of see it, think about it before you said it, it wouldn't have been as difficult, and you would not have made as many errors. Right? So that's the thing, is when we're pushed like that, high cognitive load, we're trying to do it, we're moving along, we're less comfortable, we get more wrong. And so we have to understand that in terms of what we're doing in our jobs. How does this affect you in your job? And that's what I want you thinking of this whole time, is how would this affect me? When do I have a particularly high cognitive load? And what might I need to do? If you know you're going to make more mistakes, it's a human thing to make more mistakes with a high cognitive load. If you know that's the case, what do you need to do? That's not necessarily that you can build in a bunch more time, but there are times you need to say, this is worth it. This is important. I need to take the time here to do it. So we'll talk more about what you can do about these. Constantly, they'll be thinking, how does this apply to you? So a few more key concepts we're going to look at. One of them is just really our attention, our human attention. And I think one of the best analogies I've seen for our human attention is that it's like an old-fashioned spotlight. Right? It's like a spotlight, and look at how well lit that one thing is and how much around it is not. You're not seeing anything else, but you're seeing that one thing really well. That's really our conscious attention. It's like that. It's not just that we're pointing our eyes at something, it's that we're pointing our brains at something too. We're actually pointing our attention, and we can't pay attention to everything. So what we're tuning into has a special significance. And we've kind of evolved to what should we pay attention to in different, what's going to grab our attention more. Some of that will hold you in good stead, and some won't. The idea, though, is to understand that you could be missing something because our attention is that limited. We can do this intense, conscious attention, kind of one thing at a time, and then a whole bunch of other things going on in autopilot. So if you drive, think about learning to drive or anything complex you've had to do. How hard it seemed at first. You had to pay attention to every little thing. And then when you've been doing something a long time, okay, you can put a bunch of it on autopilot and then just tune into what you need when something changes. The light changes, somebody pulls in front of you, whatever it might be. Another thing to be aware of is the importance of context. So context is just kind of everything surrounding a communication. So the situation that it's in, even the environmental factors, what is the environment, like lighting, sound, all those kind of things, but even also the relationships involved. In a courthouse, there's always some hierarchy involved, right? There's some different roles and different people in different levels of those roles. That's part of the context. That'll have an impact on how you interpret things. And so understand how much the context really has an impact. I'll give you a visual on this in just a minute, but a couple more concepts that I think tie into everything else we're talking about today. One is framing, and that's really just the way that information is presented. So there are different ways. You'll see attorneys do this all the time. They want the judge, the jury, whoever to see things. This is how you should interpret these events. Let me put this frame around it. This is the story that explains it. Might be the way it's done, right? So they're trying to frame it so that it's interpreted in a certain way. Well, we're doing, that's happening all the time. Things kind of have these frames around them, often under our conscious awareness. So we need to be aware of that. And there's also priming, which is really something that just kind of activates an association. Maybe the hoodie could activate a certain association. It's something, it's really a kind of memory that we've tied into. So they've seen, for instance, that if you hear or see the word yellow, you're going to be a little bit quicker to recognize the word banana that comes up. That yellow's kind of primed you, gotten you ready to respond in a certain way, made it more likely you're going to see things in a certain way. So these are concepts that tie into what's happening with implicit biases and, of course, what we can do about them. So here's just a visual of that idea of framing. If we say we'll call these flowers, geometric flowers basically, which one of those center circles is bigger? Looks way bigger, right? And yet, I did this myself, I just covered up most of it, and there they are. They are the same. They're the same. So this is the kind of thing, this is obviously a visual. This can happen psychologically too, not just visually. But here it is. It looks so obvious. Whoops, let me go back. It looked so clear because we took the context, what was around it, and put a whole bunch of meaning on it because of the context. So those contextual factors, the relationships, the hierarchy, whatever it might be, and I'll go forward one more time, it really just covered them up. They're the same size, and yet you wouldn't have guessed. So if we're moving quickly, going on, you would just assume that one was way bigger than the other. There'd only be a time like this where you say, well, I better double check because I know that it's possible that you might do something different. You have to know it's a possibility that you need to take that extra little bit of time and tune out what's around it, what's framing it, the context around it, to see what's really there. Right. So a little more on the terminology. When we're talking about bias, we're really just saying it's a departure from neutral. So it could be positive or it could be negative. Some departure from neutral. Of course, in the justice system, we're trying for neutrality, impartiality, everybody getting treated in a fair way. And so any departure could be an issue, but we often don't think of bias as being that it could go the positive direction. If you think of Native Americans, though, you have different stereotypes related to Native Americans. There might be the ancient link to spiritual wisdom and the drunken Indian on the res. You could have both of those. One's very positive, one's very negative. You could have someone that's actually true. Both things could be true of them. You have a whole bunch of Native Americans that none of that's true of them. And yet those stereotypes, right? They pull us from bias, and remember, they pull us from neutral. And remember how strong categories can be. Stereotypes are a kind of category. They're so strong, we have to work to override them. So implicit bias, of course, is an unconscious departure from neutral. And that's what we're talking about now, obviously, is that unconscious departure. I think in the justice system, I love working in the justice system. It's my favorite because I think there's such an amazing goal here, right, for what we're doing, what we're trying to do. And yet, I think you have to understand, it's hard to have somebody who's in that system and have to say, you know what, we actually all have these biases. Humans, if you're human, you've got these implicit biases. And so understanding that and saying, all right, I need to accept that, therefore I can do something about it. So they are common, they're strong, everybody has them. They do predict some real-world behavior. Now it's a correlation. It's not like because we know somebody has an implicit bias, which how do you know that? We'll talk about that. That they therefore are always going to respond in a certain way. It's not like that at all. It's that it's more likely that you'll have certain kinds of responses. People with certain biases will have certain kinds of responses. And a whole bunch of these come from our societies, right? Our different cultures, the different groups we're part of. And so we'll talk again more about that. We can do something about them. We can't make them go all the way away. They're part of who we are. And yet we can kind of balance them. We can do some things that help a little bit in the long run, and we can do some things that help in the moment as well. So those strategies we'll come on to. So how do you know? If it's an implicit bias under our conscious awareness, you can't see it, the person experiencing it doesn't even know it, how do you know it's there? And so lots of research has been done on this in the last couple of decades. One of the big ones, it's certainly not the only one, but the implicit association test is one of the ones that was started kind of through a couple different researchers, one at Harvard, and now a lot of it is based there as well. They've done millions of what they call implicit association tests. It's all about response time. Like you get on a computer, if you haven't done it, there's a link later to it. But it's all about how fast you can respond in terms of categorizing something as pleasant or unpleasant, for instance. And that little split second that it takes you maybe to override your initial instinct of US American society, we have a pretty strong bias toward youth over age. So we probably all have some of that, and they found it even in older people, right? It's still there. So it's those kind of things that we're saying this is, and what does that mean in terms of actual behavior? So there are some behaviors that come right down to this. Lots more on this in the resources list. There literally has been a couple decades of research now. In addition, there's one of the things on the resource list is the book Blind Spot. So it's one of the ones that explains this in pretty, I think it's very understandable, gives you a little exercises and things as well. So lots of information in that resource list, and lots of increased attention on this in the news. You might have, it was actually mentioned in the presidential debates, for instance. Right? Those kinds of things coming up. It's mentioned in terms of, the police interactions with people of color. So what's happening there? What do we do with it? So lots of attention on this, and I think it's worth looking at. What I do want to emphasize is that we're all part of a whole bunch of different social categories. So it's not like there's just one that we're part of. We're each part of a whole bunch. So there's obviously some intersectionality would be one of the things, but which group we're kind of considered, which group are we primed to respond to? So we all are gender, we have gender things, we have ethnicity, age, socioeconomics, right? You can be a member of all these different groups. And under some circumstances, maybe the gender part will come out more. People will respond more based on that category, and other times it might be a different category, the socioeconomics. So lots of different categories that are possible. These are only a few of them. There's plenty more. I have one. When you say appearance, I had a student who came to my class, and he had, the first day of class, he had a giant mohawk. So his hair was like shaved on the side and really, really long and sticking straight up, like a bristle on his head. And he came in, and where do you think I expected him to sit? I thought he'd sit at the back. Okay, there's my assumption. I categorized him, did I not? Immediately. I was surprised when he sat in the middle. And I noticed him sitting in the middle a lot, because when he turned his head, the students would be going like this, trying to see by this guy. Right, so I'm constantly seeing this and going, what is going on? And I tell you what, I did not expect that guy to be the best student in the class. Didn't expect it. And he was. He was the best student. Sorry?
What do you think about if we're good or bad?
Why? Because I thought of it as more like a punk thing, and somebody's a rebel who wouldn't necessarily follow the rules. And so I was wrong, right? Maybe he was those, and he was also a really good student, right? I categorized him, there's no doubt. I did at least notice myself categorizing him, and I've read a bunch of this stuff, so I went, okay, I need to do something. And after that is when I started making sure when I graded things like papers or essay answers, like the longer answers to essay questions, I made sure I didn't know who the student was that I was grading. So I tried to pull out the category, because when a student's gotten a B paper, all of a sudden what are they? A B student. Now they're in a category. That's a B student. What do you think is more likely they're going to get on the next paper? It's more likely to be a B. And this isn't just me, this is everybody. I mean, think about how it applies to your job too, right? Right away, you put a category. So I tried, I better do something. I know these categories are strong. What do I do? And that was something I could do, is okay, push the categories aside. I don't even know who it is. I don't know A or B student, or communication major or not, or male or female. All of that's pulled out. So trying to find some of those things that you can do, I think, is a really good idea. I've also experienced this with, I was in a very bad car accident when I was 25, so many, many years ago. But I was in the hospital for a month, a wheelchair for 4 months, then a walker, then crutches, then a cane, then back to crutches, because I had lots of operations. So I had, it ended up being an opportunity to see how people responded to me based on what category they put me in. And I tell you what, it was a different category depending what I had around me. So the wheelchair, my parents took me to the Nevada State Fair. So State Fair, where there's a carnival, Ferris wheel, all the different rides and all the different games that you're trying to win prizes. And the carnies, the carnival workers, let me win. Okay, two stereotypes going on there, right? Both the person in the wheelchair and also carnies or carnival workers. Oh my gosh, even the carnival workers let her win, right? So we're categorizing all the time, all the time. I also found when I was on crutches, now Reno is real near Lake Tahoe, so lots of skiing, and this was in the winter when I was on crutches, and I would have people come up. It was almost like they were jolly, and I'd be on, I was first time ever on crutches, I'd be going, and somebody would come up and slap me on the back, boom, what was it? A skiing accident? And I'd go, no, yay, right? But it was a total different reaction, of course. And then I went to a cane, which was a major step forward for me. That actually is a big thing. I got off of crutches onto a cane. And yet I felt a psychological stepping back from people, because a 25-year-old with a cane, right? What does it mean? What category? What is wrong? It's different. We don't understand it. Better kind of distance myself a little bit. I could feel that much of a difference. So I saw that. I'm really lucky, right? I'm really lucky that you probably couldn't even tell right now, and yet I experienced all those different levels and back and forth, and that's how we are. That's how we are. I had a judge, I told that story, I had a judge who said, he was an athlete, he was a college athlete, and he was injured, and he said, I went overnight, I first started off, I had the crutches, and if you've used crutches, they they are uncomfortable, right? They rub under your arms and your hands. You have to build up calluses, and they're not comfortable, especially if you're not used to them. And so he said he used the regular crutches for a day and just went, I can't do it. So he asked for ones that had more support, that like supported his arms, that look more permanent. And he said he went overnight from an injured athlete to an invalid in how people treated him. Like that. Every one of us, I bet every single person here has been categorized in a way that didn't feel fair to you. Every single one of us. Wait a minute, that's not fair. Whatever group it was, whichever one of the many groups you're part of, it's not fair to not be treated like an individual, to have somebody going with a category. So what do we do about it, right? How do we control that? And we are getting to that part. I do want to just kind of point this. We've got a couple lady justices here. Bruges, I got cut off there a little bit. But we have both blindfolded lady justice and unblindfolded lady justice. And I think in our justice system, we want to say justice is blind, that I don't even see color or whatever category. I don't even see it. And we know that isn't true. We humans see it before we even know we're seeing it. We're built to notice those differences. We're built to notice the categories that people belong to. It's one of the ways we can try to figure out how to do things in the world, right? To make meaning in the world. So which one of these is better? Right? Is there a better? I actually think, you have both of these. All over the world, you'll see them both. In the United States, generally more blindfolded lady justices. I actually think it's more realistic to be saying we actually do see the differences. If you don't acknowledge that we see differences before we even realize it, you can't control it. If you don't recognize that we do that, you can't control it. So now I think you need to be careful. If you got that whole, we're gonna peek out, right? Where's Lady Justice? And what are you gonna do with that information if you know who it is in front of you and what category? Well, you do know, whether you're gonna know. You're gonna know. Even if you're just reading things, you're reading applications for a job, right? You have information there that puts people in some categories, whether you like it or not. So understanding it's there is probably the more realistic way of doing it. All right, so what makes these things more likely? When is it more likely that we're going to default to some of these implicit biases, these errors that are taking place in our thinking because we rely a little too much on categories, which help us sometimes and not others, right? There are actually certain emotional states, this is fairly recent that they've found this, certain emotional states that make it more likely that we will default to these implicit biases. Okay, anger, disgust, and happiness. Now it's kind of odd to see those three all in the same line there, but they think anger and disgust, it doesn't even have to be related to the situation. It doesn't have to be related to any social group you're seeing, to the person you're seeing, the case you're seeing, whatever, right? The employee you're dealing with. It doesn't, if you are feeling angry or disgusted, you're more likely to default to some stereotypic thinking, to implicit biases. So that's one of the ones we have to be aware of. What is your emotional state? Now, so why is happiness up there? I'm just going, what in the world? And yet, it's because I think they think, now we're guessing a little bit on this, but when you're happy, you don't really want to overanalyze things. You want to just stay in your happy place, right? You just want to cruise along. You're doing fine now. I'm not going to do anything to upset this. And so you might not take that extra effort and that extra moment and think about the possibilities, both directions, positive and negative. So we have to understand our emotional states have an impact. In addition, when we have, they call it salient social categories, so social categories that have kind of been made more obvious, more noticeable, that we've called attention to them, whether it's the hoodie or the name that shows a clear gender or ethnicity, whatever it might be. If the category has somehow been made noticeable, kind of pulled out, then we're more likely to respond to the category. When we don't get a lot of feedback about what we're doing and how to make some changes, we need feedback to get better. That's how we get better. We have to have feedback. And yet, sometimes in the court system, because of hierarchy, because of the workload, sometimes we're not getting the kind of feedback we need to get better in this area. in controlling biases. If there's not a lot of accountability, now I think that depends on the job and how it's structured. But when you have areas, I think everybody has areas where maybe they're less accountable, then you need to take that extra bit of care. That's, if you have that, you might be, I don't need to worry about it, and go on to autopilot. Same is true if there's a high level of ambiguity or uncertainty. You're not sure what something means, we'll often default to our stereotypic thinking. And this is the case for certain groups more than others. People of color, especially African American men, for instance, in an ambiguous situation, most of the United States culture tips toward a more negative potential, more negative interpretation, more negative stereotype, especially when it's uncertain or ambiguous. It's maybe. So a little scary that we have some groups that's more likely that will go negative. But it is true. We have to be careful. When there's a lot of stress or fatigue, I think we all have that some of the time, lots of distractions, or just boredom from repetition. You're doing the same thing over and over and over, and so what do? You go on autopilot. And now there's only so much we can do. We do have limited cognitive resources. We're not just unlimited in what we can do. We have limited cognitive resources for that, like high-level thinking, the real rational, explicit thinking. So you have to make sure you're pointing your brain at the right time at the right thing. You know, where does that effort need to go? How do I recharge when I need to recharge? So that there's enough energy there to do this job well. And then finally, if there's a lack of motivation to be accurate and fair. This is one of the reasons I think there's less of this in the justice system. I really do. The more I work in the justice system, the higher my regard for people who are in it. It doesn't mean everybody's perfect. It doesn't mean that we all have the motivation, but I think there's a higher level of it. It's also good to be aware that the higher level is a good thing, higher level of motivation, and sometimes we need to be reminded of it, or we need to help others be reminded of how important this is and of what needs to be done, right? Keeping that in the front of our brains so we're more likely to act on it. All right, so I'm going to go into some of the strategies that have been found. There's some research on a fair number of these, although ongoing research, it's something we're trying to get better at. I've given you some of the sources, a whole bunch of it. The National Center for State Courts has some excellent information, so there's that in the resources list as well. The biggest thing we found is it's not like one thing is going to fix it, and it's not like even a bunch of things once is going to fix it. You're going to have to keep coming back to it over and over. It's because of how we're built as humans, we have to return to this over and over, remind ourselves of the need to be fair and the effects of categories and framing. And so how do you do that? How do you make sure you keep reminding yourself? So I'm going to go through some, but I do want you first, I want to kind of highlight the idea that you're going to be looking at these through your lens, what you do, and trying to see if any of these particular strategies, and like I'll give you a bunch, but there'll be several on the slide, and you pick a couple of those that you think, okay, those make sense to me, and there's something I could try at work. So I want you thinking of that to start with. And before that, I'm going to open it up. So I have a couple people with microphones. I'm going to open it up just if anybody wants to talk about a situation, and we don't have unlimited time, maybe 15 more minutes, so we want to get into the strategies. But before that, when is a time where you think this is particularly important? These things in your job, what we've talked about, implicit biases, categorizing, framing, priming, all those different things. Is there a time in your job that you think it's really critical we pay attention to it then, to what we do about it? If you can raise your hand if you have something you'd like to say. There's someone right here. Hiring. 1 second, wait for the mic.
Oh, sorry. When you're hiring, you have to be aware of your implicit biases.
Right. Hiring is a huge one, and there's lots of good research on hiring. So it's one of the areas where there's no doubt that it has an impact, that implicit biases can have an impact. So hiring, we have someone there.
The clerical front counter is a very important area to not have those implicit biases. At the location I'm at, we have Superior Court and District Court, so people are there for civil matters, for simple things like getting a marriage certificate, and it's removing those implicit biases so we can assist as best we can.
Great. That front desk, right, you have the face of the court so much of the time, and what happens there is going to impact a whole bunch of other things.
When a witness is in the witness box and is dressed in a particular way or look a particular way, you may want to think that the witness may not be up to credit or speaking the truth.
Okay, so it could go either way, right? Speaking the truth or not, but in the witness box, absolutely. Anyone else? Okay, so I think I'll move into those strategies, and then I'll leave a little time at the end to hopefully come back to what are some of the ones that resonated with you. So ideally, you're even going to jot some of these down so we can talk about them. All right, obviously this is building on what we've already talked about. So if we know that social categories have this kind of extra strength are built in, that we have to work hard on them, then actually making sure we understand that and they found acknowledging it is necessary, not to yourself, acknowledging to yourself both that there might be real group differences, right? There might be real reasons. There's sometimes some truth in stereotypes or categories we have, but so often we're like spreading that to anybody that we put in that category, our brains put in that category, when of course there are huge individual differences. So knowing that you're affected, that you may be affected, and how you might be affected. Putting extra effort into actually identifying something unique about the individual. If you know, if there's certain groups that, oh man, every time, or so much of the time that people from this group come through my courthouse, right? That people from this group, it's an issue for whatever reason it might be. Right? If you know that, then that's when you need to take the extra effort of this person in front of me. What makes them an individual? And I've had somebody say, I always try to find something that I like about the person, that I can have a positive thought. If I know there are all these negative ones, I try to think of something positive to help balance it out. And he said, sometimes that means even just like thinking of the color. I like the color of his shirt. It might come down to something small, but I noticed something about this person individually and tried to make sure I didn't have just negative associations. So extra effort in identifying those unique aspects. And remember, now look we're using the word here, effort. This is high effort thinking we're talking about. It does take effort. So how do you make sure you do that? That's going to be one of my other questions. These are some good strategies. How do you make sure you do them at the end of the day when you're exhausted, right before lunch when you're hungry, right? How do you make sure you do it at all times, not just some of the time? Or how do you make sure your staff does it? All right, control for those initial identifying factors if you can. Certain circumstances you can, and certain circumstances you can't. But say for hiring, right, if there are ways to try to pull out some of the identifying information of whether the person is male or female, or has a name that seems to identify their ethnicity, or something that makes it clear that they're quite a bit older than most of the people applying for the job, or whatever it might be, right? Is there a way to pull it out at some point? You can't always, but sometimes you can. That's what I was trying to do with grading. There will be times reframing is really powerful, is actually reversing the parties. Okay, if this were a man instead of a woman, would I respond differently? If this were a person from my own ethnic group versus a different one, would that make a difference? So really actually visualizing it, right? Visualizing, changing it over. What would it do? And then letting the front part of your brain consider, would it be different? And if it would, does that mean you should be doing something differently now? Using decision support tools, and all of there's a whole bunch of stuff out there on decision making. A whole bunch of it says some kind of structured process tends to be better on fairly complex decisions. Having some structure to your decision making. So some of the ways you can bring that structure in, one of them is to actually articulate how you came to that decision, whether it's writing it out or saying it, but actually saying, not just, okay, I got there. How did I get there? How did I reach this conclusion about this person or whatever? Checklists are huge. All kinds of research, and I'll show you a quote from Atul Gawande, who wrote the Checklist Manifesto, which talks about how it's improved human performance across the board, all sorts of different things. Aviation, medicine. You're looking at things that go, even just making sure the things we know, washing hands in between seeing patients, doctors and nurses washing their hands, is critical for not passing germs on. And everybody now knows this, and it doesn't happen all the time. Right? They know it doesn't happen because when they start tracking it, they see that's where some of the infections are coming from. And so the places that implemented a checklist and said, we're going to have to go through this, improved tremendously how many fewer infections they had from that cause that people caught while they were in the hospital. So a checklist, a simple checklist, it's improved construction of buildings, making sure you haven't missed something critical. With aviation, Captain Sullenberger, who landed the plane like in the Hudson River near Manhattan, right? Actually, okay, let's see, when 2 engines fail, what do we need to do? Lots of experience in that cockpit between him and the co-pilot, and yet they went, what are the standard procedures, and let's make sure we don't skip one of them that could be critical. So standardizing it in some way. Of course, making a point of having that high effort processing, which is really partly what you're trying to do here with checklists and standardized procedures. You don't want to just have check, 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 okay, I did it. You're actually trying to have people consider each one as they do them, right? It's not about getting the box checked, it's about considering what the box is telling you to do. And so how do you make sure people do that? How do you make sure your employees do that? As opposed to just, yeah, it's another checklist. It needs to be realistic, it needs to be something they can use, and you need to be able to point to how it's improved performance. So there is a fair amount of that. Some of the other ways of high effort processing, of kind of building that in, one of them is checking your thinking. Okay, if this is the case, then I need to do that. For me, and I know my decisions are pretty minor compared to maybe a lot of yours, but say my students care a lot about their paper and how it's being graded. I have 2 different classes, 70 students writing long papers. On the, 55th paper, I'm tired. I've been teaching this class for years, so it's not, I've seen so much of this, I know what's coming, right? And yet, so what I found is I would default to some things when I was tired like that. And what I tended to do, my default setting for that, was I would grade a little easier. Later, I graded a little easier. So how is that fair? The students who got their papers in first get graded more strictly? Like, it's not fair. I figured that out about myself, and I went, holy cow, I have to do something about that. And so I built in more breaks. I make sure I have that. I have a checklist. I have my guidelines. Here's what these grades mean. These are the grades I've given to people with similar papers. I have that, and I use that even more later because I know that I'll go into my default setting. And I want to be fair. I want to be fair. And of course, bring it up for actually internal and external debate. Let's talk about it. Let's really think about it. Let's make sure it's not under the radar in terms of how we're considering it. Pull it into the light. Pull it into the light, and that's when our prefrontal cortex, our amazing part of our brain, that's when that can actually pull in some of the things we need done to offset the things that are negative about some of those negative things. Remember, they're not all negative, but the underconscious awareness stuff can take over if we're not paying attention. A little bit more on reasons for checklists. I said Atul Gawande, in complex, high-pressure environments, experts always come up against 2 main difficulties. It's easy to overlook routine matters under the strain of pressing immediate demands, and people can lull themselves into skipping the steps. Right? I don't really need to do it this time. I know this stuff. There's quite a few checklists now, of course, in different courts and different kinds of cases that really have been found to have a major impact. The Casey Foundation has done some, and I can point you to those as well. Countering stereotypes, right? Consciously noting, I know these are the stereotypes that my society has kind of assigned to these groups so that you can counter them. Imagining the opposite, counter stereotypes, actually seeking out contact with people. If you're only seeing people from certain groups in negative circumstances, you're going to have more negative associations, especially if that's what we're getting from the press, for instance. It's just going to reinforce it. Increasing cultural awareness, seeking out images of, call it admired exemplars, so people you admire who are from those different categories. So really having something that you do differently. Maher Zain Banaji, who wrote The Blind Spot, book that I mentioned before, she said one of the things she did when she was finding out all about this is she actually created a screensaver that rotated through images of people from all different cultures, doing all different things. And this is, different gender orientations, different, all sorts of different things, just all sorts of variety in people, so that at least there would be positive images from all these groups ingrained in her mind. One of the things she decided to do. Considering the impact of your environment, balancing out framing effects, noting those areas where you have more ambiguity, building in more time where you think you might need it, making sure you have a break before doing something major. If you know, oh man, I'm going on autopilot here, I'm really tired, now I need to take a break. Helping others take those breaks when they need them as well. Mindfulness. Now the resilience session, I think you have a session on resilience here, ties right into this. Lots of good, amazing research on mindfulness. I'm telling you, you've got to see this. Some of it's in my resource list, but there are things that have been done that they have found that even 10 minutes of mindfulness training, of mindfulness meditation. So really, mindfulness is just paying attention. So focus awareness, we'll get to what it is here, the habits, kind of the reminders. But here's what mindfulness is. Mindfulness is really just focusing. It's paying attention. I mean, we put the word meditation into it. If you're not used to it, that makes it sound a lot more touchy-feely than it really is. It's learning how to focus and kind of have an awareness and a curiosity and acceptance of your thoughts, which remember, we have to accept the fact that we do have categories in our brains, that we all have implicit biases, and that mindfulness, 10 minutes of mindfulness training, they've found can counter, the tests it's been done on have been with the implicit association test, both on race and age, and they found it helped balance out racial and age biases as measured by the implicit association test. 10 minutes. Now, it didn't do that indefinitely. It did that shortly after the 10 minutes of mindfulness meditation, right? So the meditation isn't going to fix everything forever. It's going to do something now in the moment, and you're going to have to come back to it again. So I recommend, and I do have lots of resources. I would like to be a resource for you too. So I believe my email address is available, and I'd love it if you want to share ideas with me or ask questions, find out more about other resources. There's a whole bunch out there. All right, and just a few more things. Examining your reasoning process, we talked about, I think even discussing this. Reviewing your patterns, whatever it might be, whatever kinds of things you're doing. If it's in hiring, who am I hiring? Do I need to reevaluate this, for instance? Take that implicit association test. There's a whole bunch. There's at least 80 now, I think, of different ones that you can take. And just see, it tells you all about the research and lets you know like how they came to this and what it might reveal. And then, of course, seeking feedback. We've said people get better by getting feedback. That's how you get better. So how do you build that in? Feedback for yourself, for judges, for other court staff. How do you make sure they get some feedback? How do you make sure they understand some of these ideas too, and the strengths of categories, and the fact that we have to do things to balance them out? Some of that is giving them permission to speak up. Right? If there's some hierarchy, there's some people in higher positions, you have to make sure that you've let them know it's a good thing if people have questions. That ideally, the judge is open to having the comments and the questions as well, wherever it might be in the system. They found that helped a lot with doctors, right? And even with pilots, is having the other people who are actually not, they were talking to their superior in terms of their job, making sure they felt they could speak up so that they could make sure something could be done. All right, so now we don't really have time to go into it, but I want you reflecting on it for just a minute. Take a minute to think, which ones of those resonated with you? Which ones of those could you maybe use next week? Which ones might you want to pass on? All kinds of important stuff here. We have to understand that avoiding bias is obviously fundamental to your jobs, to the justice system. It's fundamental. And yet it's not easy. It's not automatic. We have all this stuff going on under awareness from our amazing brains. We have to understand what's happening there. And we have to be willing to put our attention, focus our attention on it, right? And put some effort into it. Because really, to get better, it's going to take constant vigilance. And I just want to end with this quote from Albert Einstein. We should be celebrating our differences, welcoming them as the richness and diversity which lead to true intelligence. Thank you very much.